some finger flutters for you guys. So many of you love these finger flutters, but truth be told, I kind of feel awkward when I do them. So enough of that. Okay, so I'm going to be talking about the death of Gretchen Anthony, and this all starts out in March of 2020. This was the early stages of the COVID-19 pandemic. States were shutting down, the economy was falling, and just thousands of people were becoming sick each day. The life that once tied a man named David Anthony to Palm Beach County, Florida, was coming undone. And a laundry list of failures and disappointments were making David, who was 44 years old, was making his delusions that the end times were near even more believable to him. His marriage of 5 years was ending. He had been fired again from his job after a series of disturbing outbursts towards women. His wife had kicked him out from their townhome, and he now lived with his elderly mother. In the weeks leading up to the shutdowns, David rambled on about getting a fresh start. He was going to do this in Costa Rica, and he would invite friends and people that he used to work with, and even women that he went on dates with, all expecting them to go to Costa Rica, which is a 3,500-mile trip. And before the sun rose one morning, David packed up his truck and left town. So while David was spiraling, his soon-to-be ex-wife, Gretchen, she seemed to be moving on. Gretchen was a 51-year-old newly single mother, and she was beginning to date again. She had a job she loved, and she had a daughter who was her everything. Her daughter was Ava, who was 12 years old at the time, and Gretchen was co-parenting Ava with her first husband, Jeff. As the virus disrupted daily living, Gretchen was just like everyone else, just trying to figure out how to get by. She would write almost every day on Facebook, sharing the frustrations and fears that were familiar with most of us. She shared informational videos about the virus and how to stay safe. She asked for new TV recommendations after she had finished Schitt's Creek and Game of Thrones. She reposted memes and jokes that poked fun at the absurdity of the new normal. In one of her posts, she asks, quote, "Does anyone else feel like life is being written by a 4th grader right now? There was this virus, and everybody was scared, and the world ran out of toilet paper, and then there was no school." End quote. On Thursday, March 19th, she posted a quote from a meditation blog saying, "When chaos is around you, the wisest choice is to create peace within you." After that, her profile went dark. Over the next few days, so did most of her communications with her loved ones. Gretchen's boss and close friend, Dawn Paris, she texted with Gretchen briefly on Sunday after finding out that Gretchen was sick. But when Monday came around and Gretchen did not check into work, Dawn got concerned, and she sent Gretchen a text asking Gretchen if she was okay. When Gretchen did not write back by the end of the day, Dawn sent another message that said, quote, "Hi, "Please let me know if you need something. I'm really worried about you." End quote. Finally, on Tuesday morning, Dawn received a response. In a text, Gretchen said that she had gone to the ER and passed out in the hospital after recording a 102-degree fever and low oxygen levels. Because of her increasingly dire medical condition, she said she was being transferred to an off-site location in a different city called Belglade, run by the federal government. This is the text that Gretchen sent. "Tested positive for coronavirus early this morning. That's the bad news. But I'm at a CDC coronavirus treatment facility that only handles COVID cases. The good news is that my blood type has potential to be used in the cure. Not sure if you remember me saying that I have a strain of mad cow disease in my blood. Well, that strain is significant in gathering more answers to find a cure. For safety purposes, Dr. Sinclair and her team are strongly recommending that we maintain contact with immediate family members only. I'm using my mom." So that is the text that Gretchen sent out to her friends and family. At the time, Gretchen's ex-husband, Jeff Dreyer, he had their 12-year-old daughter, Ava, with him in Jupiter, Florida. He too began receiving texts from Gretchen saying that she had been quarantined by the CDC and that she may be placed in a medically induced coma, rendering her unreachable. But Jeff wasn't buying any of this. He took a hard look at the texts. The texts were filled with really bad grammar and punctuation. Also, there was a lot of abbreviations used in the text, which Gretchen never used. But there was something familiar about this speech pattern. He did, in fact, know someone who spoke and texted like that, and that was his ex-wife's now estranged husband, David Anthony. When police eventually checked Gretchen's home, the bloody towels that were tossed in the washing machine and the overwhelming odor of bleach in the garage signaled to them how the story would likely end. In a photo taken in December 2014, shortly after their engagement, Gretchen and David were snuggling closely on the love seat with Gretchen's daughter Ava, and David shared that photo on his Facebook page. Some of the comments people wrote were, quote, "You guys fit so perfectly together," end quote, and another wrote, "Such a beautiful way to end the year and start a new one." After a short engagement, Gretchen and David got married with a wedding in Las Vegas in 2015. In all, they were only married for 5 years. Gretchen had spent most of her life up north. She attended fashion school in New York City and later earned her degree closer to her childhood home of New Jersey, where she eventually worked as a teacher. She moved to Florida sometime in 2006, but after spending 8 years working at private schools in Palm Beach County, she made a career change and she accepted an HR position with Viking Utility, which is an electrical contractor. It was a job that allowed her to connect with others, something she absolutely loved doing. Now, as far as David goes, his background wasn't anything like Gretchen's. David grew up with a single mother in Palm Beach Gardens, Florida, and he had spent most of his childhood and adolescent years pretty directionless and insecure. He usually did not speak unless he was addressed. He was pretty quiet. He was also overweight and he had low self-esteem, which made him a constant target for bullies at school. Because he was so much larger than other kids his age, he really wasn't allowed to join any of those recreational sports leagues. As a teen and young adult, he struggled with severe depression and he showed symptoms to his family that they believed to be consistent with bipolar disorder. Refusing to take any medications of any kind, David devoted every bit of himself to his physical well-being. After high school, he earned a scholarship to play basketball for Eckerd College in St. Petersburg. He idolized hyper-masculine superheroes like Thor and basketball greats like Kobe Bryant. He even named his dog Kobe. In his 30s and throughout much of his relationship with Gretchen, he worked as a trainer at Orange Theory and at other gyms. In fact, that's how he had met Gretchen. Before they were a couple, he had been her personal trainer. On paper, David and Gretchen perfectly complemented one another. He was soft-spoken, insecure, and had struggled most of his life to find his voice. Gretchen was outgoing, confident, and spent much of her career, first as a teacher and later as a human resources director, helping people find theirs. They both led pretty active lifestyles. David was a passionate outdoorsman. He really enjoyed cycling, deep sea fishing, and kayaking, and Gretchen loved going to the beach, paddleboarding, and doing yoga. For the first years of their marriage, they really did appear quite happy, but Gretchen spent the remaining 3 years trying to leave. She confided in friends that David was becoming increasingly manic and at times verbally abusive. They separated once for at least 6 months, but they wound up back together. On one frightening occasion in 2018, David believed the world was ending. He loaded his truck with 3 big bags of rice, some pots and pans, and 10 pairs of shoes before taking off. His family believed the episode was a symptom of his bipolar and manic depressive disorders. Although Gretchen recognized her husband was struggling, she really didn't feel equipped to help, and over time, as his mental illness continued to go untreated, she became less patient. In December of 2019, she sent a text to her friend saying, quote, "I wish him well and hope he learns how to deal with his mental issues. I feel bad that I couldn't help, but I think he needs to learn how to love himself before he can love anyone, something he might not experience in his lifetime." End quote. Gretchen would talk about how she would sometimes lock herself in their bedroom just to put distance between them, saying that she saw a hint of that crazy look in his eyes. David was certainly spiraling, and Gretchen really didn't know what he was capable of. Another night, Gretchen sent a text to her friend Dawn saying, again, quote, "I'm watching him on the cameras and waiting for him to go to bed. Then I'll go downstairs and get a knife to put under my pillow, just in case, and hopefully get some sleep." End quote. That year on Christmas Eve, Gretchen went through David's backpack and she found her wedding ring, her passport, her driver's license, her credit cards, and some cash. That incident worried her enough that she texted Dawn, and she told her that she was afraid of David. By the end of the month, Gretchen made the decision to leave the relationship, and she had David move out of the townhouse, and she changed the locks. 2 months later, on February 28th of 2020, she filed for divorce. After being kicked out by Gretchen, David moved in with his mother, who lived nearby. He continued training clients at Orange Theory, where he'd been working on and off for 6 years. In the weeks after his separation from Gretchen, his co-workers noticed gradual changes in David's behavior. Most days, David would be among the first to arrive at the gym. But after he and Gretchen split up, he started coming in later and seemed more withdrawn. David had previously been fired at least twice for aggressive behavior, particularly toward women. He was only allowed to come back after persuading the franchise's owner and operator, Tabitha Hopkins, to meet him for coffee. After he assured her he was working on himself and attending self-improvement workshops, she pretty much relented and gave him his job back. There was no denying David was an effective coach. When he was on, and his clients raved about him. His boss, Tabitha, said that David was an excellent Orange Theory coach, but his moods were up and down and he wasn't manageable. She said that David was difficult, and I cared about him so much because he was so talented. He was great, but it was a constant chess game with him. David, at 6'7", had this really broad, muscular build, and he pretty much commanded the attention of most rooms when he walked into them. When his energy was high, it was contagious, but when he was feeling off, his mood swings and temper seemed to disrupt everyone around him. According to Tabitha, there is no in-between with him. Basically, you never knew what David you were going to get. On January 26th, another switch seemed to flip for David. If you remember Kobe Bryant, who was David's idol, died in that helicopter crash that also claimed the life of Kobe's 13-year-old daughter. Of course, the tragedy sparked nationwide mourning, and there was wall-to-wall news coverage of the devastating deaths. Well, David was among the mass of grieving fans. In the days that followed, David broke out in hysterics. He was crying and wailing in front of the classes that he led. But when a manager offered to send him home and call in a replacement, he refused. David, imploding in the most visible and visceral manner possible, seemed to want everyone to know that he was hurting. Despite his emotionally fragile state, David continued going through the motions of his day-to-day life. Now that they were separated, he and Gretchen had begun dating other people. He became heavily involved in a controversial self-improvement program called Gratitude Training, which critics have likened to a cult. And you guys, at the end of this video, if I have time, I'm going to explain some of the crazy stuff that is part of this gratitude training. I advise you, if you're interested, to look into it, and there's a lot lot of crazy stuff about this gratitude training, but anyway, David had spent thousands of dollars on these seminars, but refused to disclose to his family what it was he did during these sessions. David continued teaching classes at Orange Theory, but on February 24th, he failed to show up to work, leaving the gym's members locked outside. When his boss Tabitha confronted him, David erupted at her again, and so she made the decision to terminate his employment, this time for good. 4 days later, Gretchen filed for divorce. Every time I say that word divorce, it reminds me of that movie The Secret Window with Johnny Depp, with the guy with the big hat who comes to him and he's like, "You stole my story." And Johnny Depp is like, "Look, dude, give me a break. I'm going through a divorce. D-I-V-O-R-C-E. Divorce." So, failure after failure, David seemed to be growing increasingly hostile, and on March 7th, the woman that he had been dating, she made reservations for one of those paint and sip classes where people drink wine while an instructor leads them through the process of painting, like a canvas painting. But David tried to, in the middle of the class, David tried to feel the woman up, and when she knocked his hand away during the session, David just burst out of his seat and he started screaming at her in the middle of the class, and he stormed outside. Later that night, as this date of his drove him back to her house to get his truck, she told him that he was not welcome to stay that night. When they reached the house, she was shocked by what she saw inside. Duffel bags filled with David's clothes had been laid out on her bed and dining room table, and food from his mother's house was stashed inside the freezer. Even Kobe, David's dog, was in the backyard. It appeared that David had already attempted to move in. So as she collected these belongings of a man that she had barely known a month, David lurked outside, banging on the windows and screaming at her. He left only after she called her neighborhood's security company. 1 week later, David had a similar episode outside Gretchen's house. While she slept in, it was the early morning hours, David was outside ranting about escaping to Costa Rica. He believed that the world was coming to an end, so Gretchen just let him kind of rant on for a few hours until she finally relented and let him inside. Later that evening, long after David had left Gretchen's house, a police officer on patrol observed David, visibly nervous and sweaty. He was pacing around outside a Riviera Beach restaurant, and at one point he was approaching a group of teenaged girls. When the officer noticed that David's license plate was partially obscured by black electrical tape, the police officer confronted him. Actually, the black electrical tape was, if I remember correctly, he had made it so that the 6 on the license plate actually looked like an 8. So the officer confronts him, and David just grew really defensive, and he blamed what was on the license plate on his 12-year-old stepdaughter Ava, saying that she really likes playing with tape. Okay. David refused to stand still rummaging around. Feeling what could come next, the officer trained his gun on David and ordered him onto the ground. When another officer arrived to provide backup, David leapt from the pavement, dove headfirst into his truck, and reached for the driver's side floorboard. One of the officers grabbed hold of David, but not before he slammed the door on her arm. He was arrested for resisting arrest with violence, and he posted bail several days later. When the officers looked beneath the driver's seat where he had been reaching, they found a large Bowie knife. By the third week in March of 2020, nobody had heard from Gretchen in days. So as Florida started locking down amid the spread of the coronavirus, Gretchen did not answer calls or texts. She had stopped sharing her location with her daughter, which is something that Gretchen was obsessive about. It was as if she had gone completely off the grid. But over a span of at least 3 days, beginning March 23rd, Gretchen's friends, her sister, her mother, and her boss began to receive disturbing and quite nonsensical text messages from her phone. In the texts, Gretchen said she'd been detained by the CDC for quarantine after becoming sick and checking herself into the Jupiter Medical Center. The text said medical staff told her that she had tested positive for COVID and would need to be transferred to an off-site CDC location. Her lungs were beginning to fail, she said, and she had been placed on a ventilator. That's pretty suspect, right? Because when you're placed on a ventilator, you are put into a medically induced coma, and they do that because there is this natural reaction to pull the ventilator out, so she would not have been able to text. So that's just, hopefully people put 2 and 2 together, which, as you'll see, they did. So Gretchen's ex-husband, Jeff, he shows up at the hospital on March 24th after receiving a similar text. There in the parking lot, Jeff sees Gretchen drove a Mini Cooper, so he sees that in the parking lot, but he sees her purse on the passenger side floorboard. But when he called the hospital to ask about Gretchen's status, an ER physician told him that she had not been a patient there since 2008. Acting on calls from her anxiety-ridden loved ones, police checked for Gretchen at her townhome on March 25th. When the cruiser pulled up to Gretchen's residence, a neighbor flagged the cops down and asked them if they were there to investigate the attack that had taken place on March 21st. That was the morning this neighbor said that she had heard a woman screaming frantically for about 15 minutes. I'm so very confused by this because why would you wait until somebody showed up and ask, like, hey, are you here to investigate the blood-curdling screams I heard for about 15 minutes? What? Why did you not call? Insanity. So for 2 days, investigators, they combed through Gretchen's home and they found a picture frame that was shattered near the top of the stairs. They find blood droplets on a comforter, which is in the master bedroom, and they find red stained towels in the washer. In the garage, there's that word again. In the garage, I'm just gonna say it how I say it and not worry about how you guys say it. In the garage, they found bleach footprints, and there was this overpowering smell of cleaning products. The violent Gretchen was still nowhere to be found. Now, let's go back a little bit. Before David would date and ultimately marry Gretchen, there was a woman named Heidi Jaegers, and Heidi and David had first noticed one another from across the room at a local networking event in Jupiter. Throughout the evening, the two of them just talked, laughed, sipped champagne. At the time, Heidi was 22 and she was just out of college, and she was working as a server, and she worked as an insurance representative as well. When she first got to know David in 2010, she noticed that he had a lot of things that he wanted in a partner, and she also had a lot of things she wanted in a partner. She felt David was attractive and charming, and he seemed relentlessly interested in her. I say that with some reservation because, oh boy, if somebody's relentlessly interested in you, it throws up red flags to me. That may not be, for most people may not feel like that, but that freaks me out. He offered her a free personal training session, and then he asked her out. And despite their 10-year age difference, they would go on to date for about 1 year. During that year, the two of them constantly reminded each other how in love they were, which is exactly what Heidi would tell herself when red flags were popping up over and over again. Like the fact that he would actually time how long she took to do her errands and how long it took her to come back home. Or that he would ask her what she ate and whether she had worked out on days that he wasn't with her. Or even how he would constantly... that was my throat frog, sorry. How he would constantly harangue her for regularly going out with her friends. But in November of 2010, David became avoidant and he began acting even more strangely. One day after work, Heidi walked in the door of his apartment where he was waiting for her, and he grabbed her hand and got down on one knee. In a moment of clarity, it dawned on Heidi why his behavior had been so off that week. It was only natural that he had nerves in the days before he would ask her to marry him. Except this was no proposal. Instead, David told her that he needed to surround himself with successful people and to be with someone who took their health and fitness more seriously, and that Heidi was not that person. David then says to Heidi, quote, "I'd like to break up with you in order for you to have time to become the person I want you to be," end quote. What a douchebag. Of course, Heidi was stunned and silent. She still had her hand still in his, until she finally found her voice and she asked him, "What the fuck is wrong with you?" And then she tore her hand away from David's, even as he insisted that it was an opportunity for her to grow. He tells Heidi, "It doesn't have to be like this," and Heidi says, "What the fuck do you expect? You just broke up with me in the most fucked up way." So she grabs her belongings from his place and she just slams the door behind her. In the weeks and months that followed, Heidi today recalls that David tried multiple times to get back together with her without success. The last time he reached out was on February 24th, 2020. 10 years had gone by without speaking. That is until one day on Facebook, he sent Heidi a message saying, "Are you single? Want to get a drink and catch up as friends?" In the next message, he answered his own question, telling Heidi how he had just seen her profile photo, which was a photo of her and her boyfriend. Then he asked about how much she would charge for dog sitting in the event that he were to go on a trip soon. Okay, so back to David and Gretchen. So while detectives investigated Gretchen's disappearance, David left Jupiter in his pickup and he drove 600 miles to Pensacola, which Pensacola is the westernmost city in Florida. After going into a couple of pawn shops to sell some women's jewelry, David and David's dog Kobe continued west, stopping for one night at a hotel in Pecos, Texas, before stopping in Las Cruces, New Mexico. From 2,000 miles away, David contacted detectives to put their minds at ease. On the phone, he told one of the detectives that Gretchen was alive and not in danger. David insisted that Gretchen wasn't comfortable speaking with investigators. Instead, he explained that Gretchen had given David a written statement, which he read aloud over the phone, and according to the statement, Gretchen had uncovered financial malfeasance at her job, and she was running away from Florida with David because she was afraid for her life that somebody from her job would come after her. The statement also implied that she was also running away from her ex-husband, Jeff, who she was also afraid of. Despite David's assurances, detectives continued to build their case. Notably, they obtained a warrant on March 29th to seize his truck, and they enlisted the help of Las Cruces police to orchestrate a traffic stop. Inside the pickup, police found 2 Amazon Echo devices and some dismounted security cameras. They held the truck, but David told that for the time being he was free to go. Back in Jupiter, detectives worked with the surveillance camera company in order to retrieve video files from the devices. Just as they had expected and suspected, the cameras had come from Gretchen's garage and porch. The footage provided investigators a window into the last moments of Gretchen's life. On the morning of March 21st, shortly after 6, detectives watched as David was silently lurking on the porch, and that porch opened up to the back side of the garage, and he was messing around with an elongated object which was in his hands. 6 minutes later, Gretchen enters the frame. As she opened the door from the garage, David hid behind in the dark. You hear Gretchen demand from David, "What are you doing?" The video showed David forcing Gretchen into the garage. Off camera, she could be heard screaming. First, Gretchen shouted at the Amazon Alexa that was inside the garage. She was shouting, "Alexa, turn on the garage light." The surveillance camera's audio captured a thud and the sound of Gretchen's kind of muffled cries, and then she again shouted for Alexa to call 911. But by her third attempt, her suppressed pleas were fading as she again tried to tell Alexa to call 911. As investigators watched and rewatched the videos from Gretchen's surveillance system, they saw David's face as he paced around the garage. The investigators at this point had seen enough. That day, March 30th, detectives obtained a warrant for David's arrest. This was no longer a search for a missing person. This was now a homicide investigation. In New Mexico, authorities canvassed the area and had multiple agencies on the lookout for David. It didn't take long, considering he had been emailing back and forth with the detective, asking when he might get his truck back. A little before midnight on March 31st, police arrested David outside a convenience store in Las Cruces. Back in South Florida, an officer knocked on Gretchen's ex-husband Jeff Dreyer's door. It was just past 2 o'clock in the morning, and the officer asks if Jeff could wake up his daughter. The officer explained to Jeff that now that they had David in custody, that they wanted to use a voice recording of Gretchen's daughter to plead to David for information. With her dad's permission, she recorded this message to David. It said, "David, it's Ava. I love you. I'm scared. I miss Mom. I need to know where my mom is. Please do the right thing and tell me where my mom is. Please, I love you." So that was a recording. Detectives end up playing this recording to David, but he was pretty unaffected. From behind bars, he refused to say anything about what happened to Gretchen, and in his typical reticence, he stayed silent for months. For as generally distant as David was towards others throughout his life, there were several family relationships that he did regard with affection. Among them was a distant relative with whom he enjoyed an off-again, on-again closeness. And that person we're going to refer to as Mitch, because Mitch wanted to use a pseudonym to identify him rather than his actual name due to the delicate family situation. So Mitch said that he and David's relationship was one where when David needed somebody in life, he managed to find Mitch. He would find the comfort that he needed, but then he would disappear again, to which Mitch says that he was fine with, because he's not a chaser and he was not going to chase David to have a relationship with him. But for as disloyal as David was, Mitch was always willing to be there for him. The last time the two saw each other was 2 days before David had killed Gretchen, when they had met up for lunch at this Italian bakery, which was in West Palm Beach. And David was clearly upset about something, and Mitch, unaware of the divorce, asked David how things were with Gretchen, and David told him, "Not great." Thinking back to that last conversation and everything that followed, Mitch says the lack of information offered up by David was par for the course, saying that David had always been exceptionally insecure and reserved, constantly overanalyzing social situations, and terrified that he would say the wrong thing. Now, after 8 months in custody, David cracked. After brokering a deal with prosecutors, he pleaded guilty to killing Gretchen in exchange for a 38-year prison sentence. This on the condition that he lead investigators to Gretchen's body. They found her wrapped in a blanket 3 miles from her home in a wooded area behind a nursing home. Investigators determined that she had died of stab wounds to her life, their broken families wearing face masks gathered in a Palm Beach County courtroom for his sentencing. Gretchen's younger sister, Sarah Carey, she was the only member of her family to speak. Refusing to say his name, she told David that she would never absolve him of his crime. And because Gretchen was a firm believer in karma, she said neither would the universe. She told him, "You can never be forgiven. You are disgusting." Then it was David's turn to speak, and he told the judge and the families that were gathered behind him in the gallery that he hadn't come to offer excuses, just context. He said, quote, "Men live by their illusions, and my illusions saw COVID-19 as an end of the world prophecy. In Armageddon, I felt compelled to escape no matter the cost. When actions become detached from consequences, that's when madness occurs." End quote. David never fully addressed exactly what happened on the last day of Gretchen's life, or the extraordinary efforts that he went to in his attempt to cover up his crime. Instead, he simply read from a piece of paper in front of him, saying, "Is there anything I can say that will comfort a girl who's lost a mother? Are there any words that will ease the burden of a mother who's lost her daughter?" To which at that point you can hear a woman's voice in the back yelling out, "No." Okay guys, so that's it. That's a crazy one. And of course it's not one of my longer videos, but we will get into a longer video either in the beginning, the end of this week, or the beginning of the next week. But now, remember I had said about that that gratitude training that David was a part of, that a lot of people refer to as a cult. If you would allow me to, I would love to. There are some things I found out. I looked into it, and I did not do a deep dive, although I would love to. If anybody's ever interested in cults, I have done so many deep dives on cults in my time, and trust me, I have a lot of information on a lot of them. So if anybody's interested in cults, we can do that too. But I've noticed a lot of true crime channels, especially ASMR channels, have covered those already, and I kind of don't want to put out another video when there's one already out like that. Okay, so now I am going to... Okay, so in this gratitude training that you heard of, here are some of the exercises that they have people do. And one of the exercises, they have the people there pretend to be a panhandler. This is supposed to teach humility, but it's extremely dangerous for women doing it alone, which is what they have women do. They also have an exercise where you go to a restaurant, and you guys, this is crazy. You go to a restaurant and pretend that there's an invisible person with you. You tell the waiter that you need a table for two. You order for the invisible person and yourself, and you send the invisible person's food back because something's wrong with it, such as there's too much salt or it's underdone, whatever excuse you can think of. Then you talk to the invisible person the whole time so the other people can hear you. Then at the end, you get down on one knee, you propose to the invisible person, and then you stand up and loudly announce, "She said yes," or "He said yes." And then try to get the other people that are in the restaurant to celebrate cooperate with you. So this is supposed to teach you how to let go of approval of others. How crazy is that? And another exercise, they have people take a dozen roses to a public place, walk up to strangers, give them a rose, and sing the song, "You Are So Beautiful to Me," all the way from start to finish. There's so much more I could talk about. If any of you are interested, let me know, because I can get into cults, trust me. I also found a website that you can go to if you're part of this gratitude training, and you can lodge a formal complaint against the corporation. And so this person, I just took one example out of so many, and what you do in this complaint is they ask you a few questions and you just answer the questions. So one of the questions is, in the complaint you describe the cult activity, and so this person writes, "This is what I experienced. The training comes under the guise of gratitude. When attending, indoctrination begins almost immediately. There are activities which encourage increased blind trust and social pressure to illuminate any previous or trusting attitudes or behaviors you may express. You are forced to give your word to a number of agreements in the first day of training in a social setting by standing for agreement and sitting for non-agreement. No one would disagree due to social pressure, even though we knew that many of the agreements were impossible to keep. Once the stage was set that we would keep our word and would increase our level of trust for unknown individuals, the next 3 days this group worked on our brains. They used lighting and staring into another's eyes to cause altered consciousness. They brought on extremely traumatic memories and even encouraged members to act out behaviors done to them by abusive parents. In my research since leaving, I've seen the methods used referred to as trauma bonding and love bombing. We gave our word that we would not share the nature of the activities we were involved in, so we didn't ruin the training for future participants. This was actually an effort to keep us from sharing the nature of our experience with those closest to us. Outside society was called the drift. We were to oppose the drift. We participated in an activity where we were told the most attractive and least attractive things about ourselves by other members of the training. Once we got a firm grasp on what was wrong with us, we were informed that we could have a breakthrough and fix these things with part 2 of training, which turns out to be $1,200. This part of training was just discovery. And of course, there is a part 3, which also requires payment and recruiting of new trainees and a large devotion of unpaid time. We were basically psychologically manipulated to convince us that something was wrong with us and we needed gratitude training to fix it. That was the only way we would have an extraordinary life, and that we would need to depend on them to be our community and provide that extraordinary life. It was incredibly disturbing, and I'm still having physical and psychological stress responses more than a week after participation. Then it asks, describe involvement with group, and he said, I was recruited by a friend who was recruited by a friend. They use a referral network to get people into the training. That way, they have somebody who can speak to you when you try to leave and encourage you to go back in. They also connect you with the coach while you're in there. series of calls while you are in the training and after you leave the training to keep you connected to the group and in the mind frame that they want you to be in. The individual who referred me is very involved in the group, and I have learned since leaving that connections with family and previous friends have been severed in favor of this group. Then it asks impact from group, and the person writes, I had to go see my therapist, who believes that quite a bit of work towards my emotional recovery from trauma has been undone in the short span of 4 days. I can't eat. I haven't been able to in a week. My stomach is in knots. I'm fearful, suspicious. I can't access certain parts of my brain. I feel like I've been a participant in a scary psychological study from World War II Nazi Germany. That's the best way I can describe it. It was incredibly disturbing, and I feel incredibly disturbed. I am even nervous posting this in your contact form because I don't want the information to get back to the individuals who hold this training before being able to report them in some way and limit their damage in my community moving forward. While part of me is aware that this level of suspicion is larger than the situation merits, it is there nonetheless. And then the form asks, is there anything else that we should know or you would like to tell us? And this person says, they require an extensive series of signatures, releasing them from damage before going into the training. They email you the email they send before you go has highlighted in bold the words based on what you tell us, and then follows that you may need a doctor's note to participate. Due to the fact that it was the day before the training and I did not have time to go to the doctor, I took their bolded and highlighted cue and did not tell them that I had any condition requiring a doctor's note. I do though. I've previously suffered from anxiety and depression, which have been successfully treated, and believe they would merely use this information to discredit my complaints against them. They have you sign a thick stack of documents. You basically sign away your rights to sue if something goes very wrong. They will present them to you and give you no time to read them. While possibly not as dangerous as some other cult-like circumstances, some attendees have ended up in psych wards. Some groups pick names. Well, he went on to explain this kind of a, I guess a known fact with cults, but he likened it back to this cult. He said that some groups pick names that imply association with a legitimate business or a university. The first session will usually not be expensive, but participants will be aggressively invited to sign up for the advantages they can get at the next level. The crowd is often peppered with people who work for the cult and claim that the training is the best thing that has ever happened to them. When they break the crowd up into small groups, they expose participants to manufactured closeness. Participants may be pushed to publicly share their deepest fears or most traumatic experiences with people who are not mental health professionals. So, yeah, that's pretty much what I pulled up, but there's just so much more. I'm leaving a couple of links. One link is to the actual the courthouse when David was reading his, whatever he had to say, and when Gretchen's family was there, and when her sister spoke. And then another link I'm going to leave is some information on this gratitude training if you are even remotely interested in taking a look into it. And I think there's one other thing I might be forgetting that I'm going to leave a link if I remember. I'm not sure. So that is it, and I have another case coming up, like I said, either at the very end of the week or the beginning of next week, that is pretty involved, and my god, I can't stand my microphone. It picks up everything. Did you guys just hear my frog voice? My frog coming out of my throat. I hate that. So, okay, so I'm going to end this now before I start to ramble, because I hate when people ramble. Especially when I'm listening to true crime. I'm like, oh my god, just